Hi there, Steve Kaufman here. There seems to be a fair interest in this idea of how I go about learning different languages, and so I'm going to deal with the requests as they come forward. And so the first request was for German. How did I go about learning German? Okay, first of all, you have to understand that my parents were born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They were born in a town called Prostějov, which is in Moravia, which was then a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which today is a part of the Czech Republic. And the Austro-Hungarian Empire was largely German-speaking, and much of, maybe a third or somewhat less than a third of the population of what then became Czechoslovakia was German-speaking. My parents spoke German at home, although they went to school in Czech, so they were bilingual in German and Czech, and they spoke other languages as well. They left Czechoslovakia in 1939 before Hitler came in, and moved to Sweden, which is where I was born, and the whole family moved to Canada when I was 5. That's back in 1951. As soon as we arrived in Canada, my parents said, "We are now in Canada, you will speak English." And so we always spoke English at home, which I appreciate, because I'm not a fan of parents who force their kids to learn the ancestral language. Certainly I learned a lot of languages before I learned German or Czech. I'm working on my Czech now. But we heard German at home, and we didn't like it, my brother and I, because like many immigrants, my parents spent a good part of their time criticizing Canada and Canadians, and there's no culture, and they're lazy, and no education, and in the old country everything was better, and so all their friends tended to be of a similar background, and so we resented them. And whenever my parents would tell me that, look at so-and-so, son or daughter of so-and-so, she plays the violin or the piano, and all I wanted to do was play hockey, and so they were a model of what to be, and so I resented everything to do with German or Czech or Europe. However, this all changed when I was 19, after 2 years at McGill University, and very much feeling that I was wasting my time at the university, and I didn't know what I wanted to do, and I was actually working on construction on a construction site, sort of like a gopher for carpenters on this big construction site. And all of a sudden they didn't need me anymore, so I was let go. I remember it was like a 2-hour commute by bus to get this construction site. But anyway, it was fun, I guess. I made some money, $2.50 an hour. I remember. I thought that was a lot of money back in whenever it was, 1963. So I went down to the port of Montreal. And for 3 days, I went to ships that were in port, and in those days they were primarily from Europe, and I asked to go on board to speak to the captain and to ask if I could work my way across to Europe. I had decided to hitchhike across to Europe, and then hitchhike around in Europe, and possibly stay there and go to university in Europe. The third day, I was lucky. There was a German ship, a small sort of tramp steamer. I believe it was 5,000 tons, but it's a very small ship. And the captain said, "Yes, we lost a sailor in Quebec City. You can come and work with us, and we'll take you across to London." So I was on a German ship. The crew was half German, half Spanish. The Germans were drunk every night. The Spanish were certainly more hardworking than the Germans. And I had my German book with me, and I can remember trying to, all the der, dem, die, das, and trying to figure out German grammar. And I guess I was able to say a few things. The Germans spoke English, the Spanish didn't. At least some of the Germans. Then I hitchhiked around in Europe, in France, and many other places, and then ended up in Vienna, where my father had arranged for me to work again on a construction site for 2 weeks as part of my tour, where I made a little bit of money, lived in an abandoned building with a bunch of Turkish guest workers, and so I guess I spoke a little bit of German there. And then I hitchhiked in German, so I was always kind of stumbling, but never could really speak the language. Then, in 1987, I was working for a major Canadian corporation, forest products company called McMillan Blodell. I was hired away by another company called Canadian Forest Products. I had a month off between jobs. I said, now I'm going to learn German. So I went to secondhand bookstores in Vancouver, and to some extent new bookstores, but wasn't that much stuff in German. But I found basically what I wanted to do was read and listen. So, the first book, I got all these books here, but I'll show you some of the ones. This was one of the earliest books I found, Im Wandel der Jahre. And so it's all full of, like somebody had, full of stuff. And let's see if I can show this better. And somebody else had marked it up, and it had all kinds of glossaries and stuff. So I just read through this. And then there was a thing called Auslese here, and it was much the same, more text, just plain reading. And I read, and I would just sit at my home for hours and hours and hours and read German. There was another one. Where was it? Anyway, there's lots of them. Quer durch Deutschland, Menschen und Maschinen, whatever I could find. Alte Legenden und neue Literatur, lebendige Literatur. This was kind of getting more advanced. Aktuelle Themen. Jetzt lesen wir. But there was one other that I thought I grabbed them, but I got lots. So I just read and listened. And I looked for any kind of CD system that I could find. The best one that I found was one that was basically radio programs, interviews with all kinds of people. I remember there was one who was a locomotive engineer in Cologne who once had the Queen of England on his train. There was a farmer from Bavaria, and it was just natural conversation. And that was actually influential because when we started The Linguist, which is the predecessor to Link, I began by going out and interviewing all kinds of people in different walks of life, because our target at that point was the sort of skilled immigrant who comes in theoretically speaking English but in fact can't communicate very well. And I felt there was nothing better than genuine conversations with people. Just listen and listen and listen. So with my German, so I did all this reading, building up my vocabulary, just out of interest. I decided then I'm going to do it. And this is something about language learning. You've got to decide you're going to do it, and then you do it in a very concentrated fashion. So I did that, and it turns out that I didn't last long at the new company, Canadian Forest Products, because I had a big disagreement with my new boss, and so I decided to bail on that company within 3 months. Otherwise, once you get going and you make contact with their customer base and everything else, I said, I'm not happy here, I made a bad decision or whatever, but I'm out of here. So then I set up my own company in 1987. Now it just so happens that in my new company, which was exporting lumber, we ended up with business in Germany. So I ended up having an agent in Germany, and in the early 90s, I traveled to Germany with him, and he would speak in German as we drove around, or as is often the case in Germany, as we sat in traffic, not moving at all. And so I worked on it, and I just would listen and read and listen and read. And when I had an opportunity to speak, I would speak. And I mean, I occasionally go back to those grammar tables, but I can't absorb them because the D-E-E-N or E-S or E-R-E-M shows up in the genitive and the neuter and I just can't remember them. So I just speak however it comes. That's the way I speak, and that's basically the nature of my German. What else can I say about German? So in the 90s is when I had most of my exposure to German. But I was there for 2 weeks a couple of years ago. I got very interested in the 30 Years' War. I mean, I could go and grab them. I got lots of audiobooks in German. And in particular, this one audiobook on the 30 Years' War was fascinating because I had a Eurail pass for Germany, and I was in Augsburg and in Munich, and then I was in Prague. And so these are all places that were very much involved with the 30 Years' War. And then I took the train, and eventually I was up around Hamburg and Cologne and so forth and so on. But whenever I go to Germany, I enjoy it. I try to use it as much as possible. I find, like every language, I find it fascinating. I only wish I had more time to spend on German, but basically, I am sure that hearing German as a child helped me, but you have still got to make the effort. And to me, before I start speaking, I need words. So therefore, my first impulse always is to read, and to read a lot. So I was reading that month that I took off in 1987, I was reading 3, 4, 5 hours a day, reading and listening, reading and listening. And that was essentially my experience when I learned Chinese, when I learned Japanese, reading and listening. And you don't have to be in the country to do that. Now, yeah, there you have it. That's my German situation, and I got to run now, or I'd do the other ones. There were some people asking me about Swedish and French and Spanish, so we'll eventually get to those. Anyway, there you are. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.